Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I wish my mother could have heard that. So, big thank you for being invited. It's always a real pleasure coming to Hong Kong. And I was given a very different topic from what I'm used to be invited for. I was given a very non-controversial topic, a journey into the future of IVF, which obviously goes along with the theme of this conference, has conventional IVF reached its limits? But as you know, I like a little bit of controversy, and so even though it's a non-controversial issue, I hope I can bring a little bit of controversy even to that subject. So my conflicts are listed here. I don't really think that any of these listed conflicts had anything to do with what I will be talking about today. And I think this quote by Paul Valery, "The trouble with our times is that the future is not what it used to be," is really a very representative quote for what I am going to talk to you about today. It obviously started 40 years ago, and I think we are still in 2018, and therefore it needs to be mentioned that this is the 40th anniversary of the Brown baby. Bob Edwards and his partner received the Albert Lasker Clinical Medical Research Award, interestingly read in 2001. You may not know this, but this is an award given by the Lasker Foundation in New York City, and about 70 or 75% of recipients usually get the Nobel Prize. And for the longest time, it was believed that Bob wouldn't be amongst those, but he ultimately did receive the Nobel Prize pretty late in 2010, too late for him to attend. Really pretty tragic. He died on April 10, 2013. And this is another quote which I think well reflects on what I'm going to tell you. What the future has in store for you depends largely on what you place in store for the future. And this really brings me to my topic today, which is a little bit less optimistic than what you have heard from Simon and from some of the other speakers, because I frankly not only do not think that we have reached the limits, but I actually want to show you that I think we have deteriorated. And that may surprise you. But what you see here are the live birth rates in the US until 2014. And as you can see, a remarkable success initially. We really made immense progress in the early years of IVF. We peaked around 2001 and 2002, then plateaued, then had a little valley, went back to the plateau, but over the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen a very significant decline. And that's, I think, per se evidence that we have not reached the limits. Maybe the limits were reached in 2001, and nothing has happened since then. Indeed, what seems to have happened is that we have gotten worse. And I think that is very troubling. And I think it requires an analysis of why that is. Now, what I also find very troubling is that nobody is talking about it. And it is not only happening in the US. You see here, 10 years of IVF history around the world. Different regions, excluding Europe, because the ESHRE data are so inconsistent from year to year that they have really no value. But what you see here in light blue is the US. And you see that the numbers of autologous cycles have remained pretty steady. But you see that there's one curve that is dramatically increasing in numbers of cycles, and that is Japan. And then you see that the vast majority of regions in the world have remained the same. But when you look at live birth rates, you can also note that the US, which is the top line with the interrupted line, is not the only one that has shown dramatic declines in their live birth rates. Indeed, when you look at the lowest curve, which represents Japan, you will notice that Japan, over this 10-year period, lost 2/3 of its live birth rate. 2/3. Japan, already in 2004, had the lowest live birth rate of any larger region in the world at roughly 15%. By 2012, and those are national reported data that I'm showing you here, by 2012, the live birth rate per cycle start in Japan was 5%. Isn't that amazing? And guess which is the country that showed that increase in IVF cycles over that time period? It's Japan. In other words, Japan lost 2/3 of its cycles over 10 years, and over the same time period tripled the number of cycles. So over the last 10 years, by maintaining, in order to maintain the same number of live birth, they had to do 3 times as many cycles. Is that progress? Is that where we want to go? And how come nobody talks about this? And there are obviously, let's try this. I'm stuck.
Can you advance the slide, please?
Can we get the next slide? Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, and as you can see, Japan is not the only country that shows even larger declines over this time period. The curve that nicely ascend up to 2009, 2010 is Australia, is Canada. And something then happened in 2009, 2010, because you can see suddenly their live birth rates dropped dramatically. Well, I can tell you what happened in Canada at that point. The biggest province made a deal with the government. That's always dangerous. They made a deal under which basically the IVF community promised the state government, the province government, that they would go to single embryo transfer for the vast majority of cycles. And in return, the government offered them coverage for IVF for a number of cycles. Now, the deal is over because the government discovered that it cost much more than they thought, but that is not the point. The point is that the moment Canada moved, or that province moved to single embryo transfer, this is what happened to the Canadian data. Imagine what happened in that province in terms of declines in live birth rates, because this is obviously diluted by the rest of Canada that didn't make this deal with the devil. So one thing to learn, maybe single embryo transfer is not such a great idea. Indeed, when you look, coming back to the Japan curve, there's also an association with the timing of that decline. And that association is what you may have heard about, the so-called Kato protocol. The so-called Kato protocol was published about 2 years before this curve starts. And it slowly took over Japanese IVF. And today, the vast majority of Japanese IVF centers more or less follow the Kato protocol. And what is the Kato protocol? It's mild stimulation, single embryo transfer. There's not one study in the literature that has shown better pregnancy rates from mild stimulation and single embryo transfer over standard stimulation, yet the whole country is doing it. And not only any country, but probably the country with the most sophisticated knowledge about reproductive physiology. What amazing research is going on in Japan. And yet, that country that is giving us this amazing research has by far the poorest live birth rates in the world. And Canada, which also now runs these horrible live birth rates, is another highly developed country. And when you look at the third curve here that represents Australia and New Zealand, another highly, highly sophisticated country in terms of reproductive research, they too have shown a steady decline in live birth rates over these 10 years. And again, as I will show you in a second, highly associated with the introduction of blastocyst stage culture, single embryo transfer. And the result are fewer babies born. So why the declines? I think extended culture to blastocyst is one. My friend Pasquale gave an amazing talk today, but at one point I personally disagree with him, is that everybody should be cultured to blastocyst stage. I don't think that that is wise for a number of reasons, not the least that I don't think that there is anything in the world that we should do to everybody, including blastocyst stage culture. But moreover, I think blastocyst stage culture also demonstrates another major problem in our specialty. And that major problem is that we do studies in highly selected patient populations, and then we extrapolate the data to everybody else. And blastocyst stage culture is a very good example. The initial studies by the Colorado group, when Gardner was still there, were made on highly selected good prognosis patients. And indeed, if you have a young patient who has 15 beautiful 8-cell embryos on day 3, if you culture them to blastocyst stage and you lose even 2 or 3 or 4, no big deal. She still has lots of good embryos. And indeed, those that you transfer will give you marginally better pregnancy rates than day 3 transfers. Absolutely correct. But that does not mean that that is true for everybody. Indeed, after the Colorado group published their paper, there are at least half-a-dozen studies that tried to repeat their results in general populations. They all failed. And meta-analysis have repeatedly shown that blastocyst stage culture does not improve pregnancy rates in general population. It works only in good prognosis patients. And in poor prognosis patients, where you have very few embryos, they may not even make it to blastocyst stage. And some of them may still give you healthy babies, even though Pasquale doesn't believe that is true. I must say I do. So this is a good example, and there are many more, where good studies were performed. They were performed in highly selected patients, usually good prognosis patients, because we want to get the best results. And then kind of the results float over the general population, and we start doing something to everybody, which really never was proven to work in those other patients, but in that initial patient population. Elective single embryo transfer in itself is subject for discussion. I'm known as not being a big fan. I do not believe personally that twins are the end of the world or catastrophic. I think twins are a very good solution for many infertility, not all infertility patients. But there can be no doubt, that is, nobody's questioning that doing elective single embryo transfer on everybody, and some of our European colleagues are even now advocating to do it in women above age 42, is insanity. It doesn't make sense. Embryo banking. Again, what is the idea of freezing eggs and embryos in older women, for example? We have known for almost 40 years that the older the patient is, the worse embryos freeze. So here we are freezing 40-year-old patients, 43-year-old patients, so that they have more embryos that don't thaw out and we have to throw out at the end. Again, a policy that suddenly has become the fashion of the moment. Everybody does it. There's no data and support for it. When you think carefully, it's counterintuitive. It does not make sense. But those are the reasons for the declines, because these are the things that have been happening over the last 10 years. We have, as Pasquale has so well demonstrated, we have added on and on to our IVF experience, and instead of getting better, we have gotten worse. Mild stimulation, natural cycle IVF. After age, the number of eggs and embryos that the patient produces in an IVF cycle is statistically the second most important predictor of IVF outcome. If you agree with this statement, why would you do a mild stimulation or a natural cycle IVF where you get one egg in 60% of cycles? It doesn't make any sense. Yet, there are tons of IVF programs that believe in this. Oh boy, PGS, PGTA. I was not supposed to talk about it. Indeed, I don't have a single PGS, PGTA slide in my talk. But then I heard Simon. And I cannot help myself.
You can.
The SART data he showed you, we recalculated. And we recalculated those SART data based on intent to treat, because the SART data he showed you, as I have to give him credit, I think he said, were based on embryo transfer. And we recalculated that paper in Fertility Sterility, and an amazing thing happened. Fertility Sterility accepted that recalculation as a paper. We were stunned. We never expected that. And when we recalculated those SART data that SART had indeed published, what became very quickly apparent is that they were false. And of course, every data that relates to embryo transfer in IVF. And I'm not only talking here now about PGS or PGTA. Every data that relates to embryo transfer as the reference point for outcome assessment needs to be stated as such loud and clear, because it means that all the poor prognosis patients who don't make it to blastocyst stage, because most centers now routinely culture to blastocyst stage, that don't make it through PGS because they don't have even a single normal embryo, all of these patients have disappeared from calculation. So once again, you're getting clearly biased data. And that also applies to the studies that Simon mentioned. Scott's study. Yes, it was a randomized, prospectively randomized study. But what he didn't tell you is when Scott randomized. He randomized when patient made it to embryo transfer. Now, once again, that doesn't make any sense, because once again, all the poor prognosis patients were not included. So you have to be extremely careful when you read the literature, because a very big part, even in our most accomplished, most prestigious specialty journals, a lot of the data that you see is what our president calls fake news. So, elective single embryo transfers have been increasing all over the world, but what this slide shows you, they have been increasing in parallel with declines in what I've shown you as live birth rates. The Japan slide shows you what I already mentioned, how pregnancy or live birth numbers declined in parallel with cycles increasing, and interestingly, you see a very similar comparison on the right side for Australia and New Zealand. There too, exactly the same association, just at higher live birth rates. And this is embryo banking. And embryo banking is, again, a story in itself. We have published it. Everybody here understands what embryo banking is. It means we don't transfer. Now, sounds to me not very logic in the first place, but there's even a secondary hidden agenda behind it, which we discovered when we studied the embryo banking cycles in the United States. And what we found is two interesting things. And we first of all found that the cycles that had underwent most embryo banking were in oldest patients. Again, totally counterintuitive based on what I said already before. The older a woman, the worse her embryos freeze and thaw. But that's the patients where most embryo banking has been happening, at least in the US. And then we did another thing. Then we excluded embryo banking cycles from reported SART data, and this paper was also published last year in RBM Online. And we recalculated for all the 500 or so IVF centers in the US their live birth rates. And we looked at the 10 centers, amongst them some very famous ones, that had the highest percentage of embryo banking cycles. And we recalculated their live birth rates, assuming those embryo banking cycles, which under SART rules did not have to be reported, they just disappeared from statistics, assuming they had to report those as well. And guess what happened? When we normalized for embryo banking, we found that those 10 programs that had the highest embryo banking rates had uniformly live birth rates that were below the median of the other 490 IVF cycles in the US. And some of these programs reported the highest live birth rates amongst all those 500 programs without the embryo banking cycles. So now add up that it's the older patients who get the embryo banking, and what I've just told you now embryo banking is a very convenient way of manipulating your outcome data. So I'm not going to go more into the PGS, PGTA discussion, but I personally think that it's a worthless test that particularly harms older patients and women with low ovarian reserve because they can the least afford false positive diagnosis. Pasquale did an excellent job in discussing the point. He just did not mention one additional strong argument, maybe the strongest argument of them all, why I think that PGS is a futile effort. And that is the fact that there is now convincing evidence that the embryo has an amazing capacity to self-correct downstream from blastocyst stage. So many so-called chromosomal abnormality, mostly mitotic ones, which are in contrast to meiotic aneuploidies, clonal. In other words, few cells here, few cells there, they self-correct. And they frequently are being picked up and are the reason why embryos are declared either mosaic or aneuploid. I personally don't differentiate between those two as Simon does, because the differentiation by the PGTA industry between what's a mosaic embryo and what is a so-called aneuploid or normal embryos, those cutoff points in DNA load are simply out of hot air. There's no scientific evidence why 80% DNA load in a single 5-cell biopsy differentiates between mosaic and abnormal and 20% between mosaic and normal. 20% cutoff was chosen simply for one reason, because even modern-day NGS equipment has a sensitivity of 20%. And so that's the reason why the cutoff is 20%. So theoretically speaking, an embryo with 19% abnormal DNA load is normal, but an embryo with 21% is quote-unquote mosaic. Same thing with the 80% cutoff. No really reason that makes any sense. A 79% DNA load, therefore, means you can potentially transfer. An 81% DNA load means this embryo needs to be thrown out. It's ridiculous. There is no other test in medicine where such a ridiculous way of determining a hugely important point, which embryo we throw out, is determined on nothing. No real data. So be aware of dogma. I think we have too many of these dogmas that we are mindlessly following. We assume that everything is a constant. We assume that all that all lab values are the same. I heard in one of the presentations today that an FSH up to 10 million international units is normal. It is not. It obviously depends on how old the patient is. The same thing for AMH, the same thing for antral count. If you use the same FSH judgments and the same AMH judgments in a 43-year-old as in a 23-year-old, then you will never discover the patient who has low ovarian reserve early enough to do something about it. Lab values are not constants, particularly not in endocrinology, where not only in our specialty, in all endocrine areas, where lab values are totally dependent on age. Same ovarian stimulation for all. Not true. It's maybe the easiest way to run an IVF program, but it is not the way how you run an IVF program today. LH for all, same thing. Same luteal support for all. PGS, PGTA for all. There are people that do PGS for egg donors. 22-year-old egg donors. As if egg donation wouldn't cost enough already without $4,000 for PGTA. So there's no constants in biology. I think there's only relativity, And we need to understand that lab results are age-dependent. Depending on other hormones, the ratios are sometimes very important. Different endpoints for ovarian stimulation. I'll be talking a little bit more about that in a moment. Different ages and different ovarian reserve criteria obviously require individualization. And therefore, if I have to give you one message for the future, it is that the future of IVF is in individualization of the IVF cycle. What does that mean? It means that some patients' ovaries need to be prepared in order to maximize their performance. I don't have time to go into detail, but there are a few examples for that. I think the one that we have published most about is obviously the relative hypoandrogenism in older women and in women with premature ovarian aging. IVF patients are aging. Our specialty is graying. We are seeing older and older patients in our practice, which means that we see patients with more and more unrelated medical problems, which may or may not interplay with our specialty. But we need to be aware of that, and we need to be ready to address it. You don't want to find out once the patient is pregnant. You want to be ahead of the game. I mentioned ovarian stimulations. You don't stimulate a 45-year-old patient the same way as you stimulate a 25-year-old. And here, highly individualized egg retrieval. I don't have the time to go into it, but we discovered it is now almost 4 years ago when some of our biologists started looking at the intrafollicular milieu in older women. And the reason we did that was because our center serves a very unusual patient population. Over 90% of our patients come to us after they have failed, usually multiple IVF cycles at multiple centers, and in addition, we have the by far oldest patient population of any of the 500 reporting IVF centers in the US. And what we noticed in our outcomes was that until age 43, we saw the expected slow decline in pregnancy and live birth rates, and then after age 43, boom, there was a plunge. And we didn't understand what it was that caused this sudden cutoff. And so that's why we started looking at the follicle in older patients. And what we discovered is that basically the whole metabolism within the follicle speeds up. And that is also the reason why, as I'm sure most of you understand and know, cycles shorten as patients get older. And so once we noticed that the older the patient was, the earlier we saw signs of premature luteinization in the follicle, the question came up, what do we do next if we don't want to expose the eggs to this toxic environment of a prematurely luteinized follicle? And so we decided to simply take the eggs out earlier. And we started taking out the eggs at 16 millimeters, trigger for HCG 16 millimeters instead of 19 to 22, which I think we all did until recently, we at least. But as we started doing that, we noticed that if women were older than 43, even 16 millimeters was too late. We still got lots of atretic follicles. And so to cut the long story short, we now routinely trigger some patients at age 45 and older at 11 and 12 millimeter lead follicle sizes. And we're getting mature eggs. And our oldest patient ever to deliver with her own eggs, she was a few weeks short of 48 when we transferred her. We recently reported her. She was triggered at 12 millimeters. And we got 3 or 4 eggs, and she got pregnant with with a follicle retrieved at 12 millimeters. Now, if you had told me 5 years ago that I would give HCG to patients at 12 millimeter and get mature eggs, I would have declared you insane. But I'm telling you that if you want to treat older patients, that's what you need to do, because otherwise you'll get older-tratic eggs. And the individualization also carries over into the IVF laboratory. We are treating the eggs and embryos of older patients differently from younger patients. And I don't have the time to go into it, but I'll be happy to tell you privately what we do. One important point, because we talked so much here about time-lapse and embryo selection, another favorite topic of mine. Because embryo selection, what does it mean? It means that we have a bunch of embryos, and we're trying to figure out which one of those embryos can give us the best pregnancy chance. But think about it again for a moment. This embryo is the end product of an at least 3 to 4 months journey from time of recruitment of a follicle through follicle maturation, retrieval in cases of IVF. 3 to 4 months. Do you really think that after all what happened during those 3 to 4 months to that egg and that embryo, that there is still very much we can select from? Of course, there are minor differences. But I think it is naive to believe that we will get, with modern technology or with God knows what other famous intervention down in the future, this miracle that will tell us, yes, this embryo will get pregnant or will lead to pregnancy. I don't believe that at all. It biologically does not make any sense. If you want to really do something about the quality of your embryos, you need to do what Pasquale suggested in his talk. We need, after 50 years of concentrating our whole effort in fertility on the last 2 weeks of this journey, the gonadotropin-dependent phase, that's where we have been in our field for 50 years. Then we need to go earlier into follicle maturation. There we can maybe make a difference. Maybe. Because the ovarian environment in which this follicle maturation takes place is very important. And nobody has looked at it. So the lab is also very important, because you obviously, in difficult patients, care more about every single egg and every embryo. And that brings us into this whole issue of in vitro maturation. If you still do get immature follicles, but I don't have time to discuss this, maybe in the question and answer period we can talk more about it. Finally, individualization again means also that you need to prepare your patients for their OB care. And since they do have medical problems, that means that they need to be ready to go into OB care. They should have seen their perinatologist. They should have an OBGYN. Not that all of this starts only once they are surprisingly pregnant. We have had so many patients who had difficulty finding an OB doctor because they didn't want to take her on because she was 46 years old. So we learned our lessons, and we now make sure that when we have older patients, we make sure they have a doctor to take care of them if we get them pregnant. So you all know that our patient population is graying. Those are the US rates. And you see here that in younger patient populations, fertility rates have been declining in the older patient populations. That's where the business is. And that's where pregnancy rates are going up. I think the computer is sending me a message about my time. Oh, here it goes. This shows you our center's age distribution. I suggest you look just at the 40 to 41 group, which is the fourth triangle when you look from 12 o'clock down. So you can see that everything after that age group means they are over 41. And it will therefore not surprise you that in 2017 our center's median age was 43, and I can bet you, based on what I've seen in 2018, we will be this year over 44. It's remarkable. Now, we are an extreme situation, I recognize that, but every colleague I talk to in the US, and I understand in Europe as well, has the same experience. Patients are getting older and older, and that shouldn't surprise because IVF has gotten okay everywhere. The young, uncomplicated patient can go anywhere. She will get in and get out quickly. She'll get pregnant. The patients who stay, who linger and come back and back are the more complicated older patients, and then obviously more older patients are trying to get pregnant, and that's why we all better get ready with taking care of older patients. And pregnancy is a stress test on every organ in the body, and we need to understand that, we need to communicate that to our patients, and we need to test them out before we help them conceive, because we want to be ahead of the ballgame. And I think my computer is really telling me something. I think I'm going to end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.